Good morning, everybody, and welcome to SU's second annual Anti-Racism Summit. I emphasize welcome because you are all welcome here, everyone. Welcome to the first Friday of spring semester. I don't know about you, but it couldn't come soon enough for me. And welcome to the first week of Black History Month. Of course, this isn't the only month when it's appropriate to discuss and remember Black history, but it's always good to be mindful of the trajectory of the past. It has been more than 400 years since the first enslaved Africans were brought to North America. It has been more than 150 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth, and the passing of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in the US. And it's been more than 50 years since the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who fought so hard and spoke so eloquently about the need for equality and equity if we are to have a truly just society. I say these things to emphasize that progress towards social justice and equity has been slow, painfully and agonizingly slow. There have been well-intentioned attempts to level the social, economic, and political playing fields, but too many implicit biases remain built into our customs, rules, and laws. Today, we welcome Dr. David Stovall to help us learn about critical race theory. Most of you know that CRT is a political flashpoint, mostly because of misunderstandings and misinformation. It makes me sad that there are colleges and universities where a discussion of this type is actually off limits, but not here. We are all here because this is a place of learning, and we are all here this morning because this is an important topic to learn about. Your presence here this morning demonstrates a desire to be better informed, to create a more equitable campus community, and to work toward that goal for our entire society. I look forward to hearing from Dr. Stovall, an expert in CRT, and I also look forward to the discussions that follow and to the actions that we take as a result of that better understanding. I'd like to thank Kathleen Arbon, Dr. LaWanda Dawkins-Mills, Dr. Chris Egan, Dr. Deneen Long-White, Dr. Brian Flores, Dr. Aston Gonzalez, Dr. Jennifer Jewell, as well as Eli, Gina, Lucy, and many others who helped to plan and put this event together. I will now turn the program over to Dr. LaWanda Dawkins-Mills, who will introduce our speaker. LaWanda.
Thank you, Dr. White. Good morning. How wonderful that we can all meet together this morning in this virtual space on the campus of Salisbury University, located on Delmarva's Great Eastern Shore. I am Dr. LaWanda Dawkins-Mills. I serve as the interim special assistant to the Vice President of Student Affairs. To Dr. Charles White, University President, the Offices of Student Affairs, Academic Affairs, Diversity and Inclusion, and the 2022 Summit Planning Committee, thank you for your insight and forward thinking that has created this platform to host the university's second annual Anti-Racism Summit. This summit joins the university's broader plan for open, impartial dialogues that explore the realities of current issues that impact our campuses and communities. Among those talks are the matters of institutional and systemic racism and the lingering impact to campuses of higher education and organizational systems. It is my immense pleasure to introduce to you and welcome to our campus, Dr. David Stovall, a highly sought after university lecturer. Dr. Stovall is a professor of Black Studies and Criminology, Law and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Stovall earned a PhD in Educational Policy Studies, a Master's of Education in Educational Policy Studies, and a Bachelor's of Art in History from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research investigates three areas: critical race theory, the relationship between housing and education, and the intersection of race, place, and school. To bring discovery into action, Dr. Stovall initiates open conversations in schools and communities that address issues of equity, justice, and abolishing the school to prison pipeline. To this effort led him to join the design team for the Greater Lawndale Little School Village School for Social Justice, where he also serves as a volunteer social studies teacher. That trajectory led to establish the People's Education Movement, a collection of students, teachers, professors, and community leaders in Chicago, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area, who participate in cooperative, community-based projects which produce relevant curriculum. Today's topic has recently exploded in public, political, and social arenas. What is critical race theory and why is it controversial? Salisbury University faculty, staff, students, and honored guests, please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. David Stovall.
Thank you, Dr. Dawkins Mills. Thank you, President. And thank you to all the folks who are here in attendance. I really want to thank Lucy Weirman, and I hope I'm saying your name right, because you contacted me some time ago. And anytime that I am contacted in this day and age with all the heat that critical race theory is getting, I'm always wondering whether or not that call or pitch out to me would be recalled. So thank you. And thanks to the folks at Salisbury for not recalling and uninviting me, because that has been in my trajectory over the last little bit. I will be invited to something. I guess folks will maybe see a YouTube or something, and then they'll send me an email saying thanks, but no, right? So to be welcomed by you it means a lot, especially in these times. And it means a lot because we are in a moment that we've been in before, but we haven't really recognized it because the United States is so ahistorical, right? So what I want to talk about today is how we get to this moment, but also really kind of bringing us into how we got here, really in our discussion about critical race theory. And before I do that, I also want to thank Eli Modlin for talking with me about some of the things that you all have experienced on the Eastern Shore of Maryland at Salisbury University. And then Gina Bubar for making sure that everything was situated and keeping in contact with me as the work moved forward. It's the people who do the day-to-day things that deserve recognition, because in those spaces, we know that without them, these things do not happen. So I wanted to express my sincere thanks to folks for actually engaging in that. So let's get into it, y'all. How did we actually get in this moment, right? I'm gonna take you all back to March of 2020. And for anybody who's in political science, anybody who's in any ethnic studies courses, anybody who may be taking history courses, you might run into a person by the name of Christopher Rufo. And Christopher Rufo is an interesting person. He is a research fellow at a place called the Manhattan Institute, which is a conservative think tank. So they publish policy reports about social issues and the ways in which people should rethink those social issues and the problem with governments and how they address social and economic issues, because the Manhattan Institute has produced literature and research on both social, political, and economic issues. So Christopher Rufo in March of 2020 was on Fox News, and he was talking about something called microaggressions. Now, easy way to understand microaggressions, these are the daily, minute experiences that people have with racism that accumulate over time. So he's talking about this, and then he talks about microaggressions stemming from critical race theory. Now, as Rufo is explaining this, Donald Trump is watching the broadcast. So Once Donald Trump sees this, he hears about microaggressions, he hears about critical race theory. In April of 2020, a month after he sees Christopher Rufo, he comes out with Executive Order 13950 that comes from the White House's business office that prohibited any conversation of critical race theory or any conversation talking about one racial or ethnic group being better than the other, conversations about structural or systemic racism, or that racism was the fault of one particular group. And what is interesting is that CRT says none of those things, right? So it's important to put this in the context of how we get in the misinformation campaign. So once Executive Order 13950 comes out, you also start to see people responding, talking about anti-CRT legislation, taking over school boards, making sure that young people aren't being taught racism. And these are all nonsensical when you actually interrogate CRT. And this is a question not just about critical race theory, but this is really about society, particularly in the United States, and how we obfuscate and mythologize history. And historians often remind us that our history has never meant to console us. Our history is always meant to challenge us. So now it's challenging us around understanding what has gone forward, but also making sure that you do the work to see that it never happens again. So there's a political project of history. So now, here being February, when we talk about folks like Carter G. Woodson, who actually founded Black History Month here in Chicago, he was talking about who has been excluded and what has been the rationale of their exclusion. So when we look at people now taking over school boards and organizations like Turning Point that are talking about CRT, you got a website called Stop CRT. So all of this is coming without an understanding of what CRT has put forward. And this becomes the most problematic because the battle that we're currently in isn't all about CRT, but is also about the historical record. And can we take a critical perspective with historical accuracy? And the issue becomes, if young people are engaged with historical accuracy, then they will have questions that adults do not or cannot answer. And that's the issue. So now when we put this in conversation, we have to now consider, what does it mean to refute historical accuracy? And then how does misinformation target something like critical race theory with no understanding of what it is? So now let's get into what CRT is. Critical race theory is a response to something that was called critical legal studies. So if you look at legal scholarship, you'll see the work of scholars in the 60s and 70s who talked about the criminal legal system being a class-based system. In 1973, Derek Bell wrote a book called Race, Racism, and American Law. And what he did in that book was challenge people to think about the criminal legal system in the United States is not only a system based on class, but it is also a system based on race, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender, religion. So now when we start to think about the multivariant ways in which the criminal legal system operates, now we have to consider that race, class, age, ability, gender, sexual orientation have to be in that conversation. It is not class. And those things that I mentioned are not merely an outgrowth of class. So now these things have always been in conversation with each other. Critical race theory takes an analysis of things like the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. And the argument is that racism is ordinary and ingrained in US society. Let me give you all an example. If we think about the 13th Amendment, and if there are any attorneys in the audience today, attorneys and contracts always have what's referred to as a convenience clause. And the convenience clause just means if something happens the wrong way, you go back to where you started. And let's look at the example of the 13th Amendment. Many of you all have seen the documentary 13th. The 13th Amendment says the institution known as slavery has ended except for punishment for a crime. And this becomes important because there are two words here. Involuntary servitude become important because involuntary servitude is enslavement. So, except for punishment for a crime, slavery has ended. Now, the question that I ask my high school students, the question that I ask my undergrads, the question that I always ask my graduate students is, where does slavery continue to exist in the United States according to the Constitution? Prison. So now, when we begin to think about, you have these advances, but you still have an underlying current that goes undiscussed. And to give you all an example, some people have read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and she puts out a data point that becomes important. There are more Black people who are currently incarcerated or under some form of state or federal supervision, meaning parole, work release, supervised release, than there were listed as chattel property in 1850. So if we put that into context, that slavery, although outlawed, except for one instance, still exists. And critical race theory says we can't ignore that. And now, because we can't ignore that, we have to look at structures that actually ensure or make it much easier for certain people to be incarcerated, right? So now when we start to think about this in particular ways, so the argument of critical race theory is that racism is normal, endemic, grounded, foundational to life in the United States. And I appreciate the president's comments today, because the other thing that critical race theory reminds us is that there are three foundational things that we refuse to talk about in the United States that were foundational to its development. And that is enslavement, genocide, and settler colonialism. So now we only talk about these things as an aside. Oh, that happened in the past. No, those things are key to the development of land, railroads, cities, and rules in those cities that regulated particular populations, whether they be Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian American, and Pacific Islander. So now when we start to think about those three things, it now puts us to understand something like the COVID pandemic is really a pandemic amongst two other things, right? So a pandemic just means a problem across region or nation. So right now, we are actually under three pandemics, not just one. So we got COVID, we got white supremacy, and we got capitalism. So now when we think about those three pandemics, something like critical race theory says, we have to look at foundationally what the United States has been and tries to fool itself that it isn't. And one of the ways that it tries to fool itself is looking at what happens in schools. And this is the issue and concern in schools. The United States is fixated in myth. Critical race theory is intentional about interrupting the myth. So now when we talk about that myth, and we're still telling young folks about Columbus's discovery of a place where that people already were, and we have discussions around founding fathers who owned people and had children by them, i.e. Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, we now have to think about what does it mean to revisit that? And it dishevels people. Right? What do you mean? What? I thought this was places where we can pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for some. And I think it's important, that caveat, for some. The question that we have to ask is, who is excluded? Another component of critical race theory is something called interest convergence. Easy way to explain interest convergence is that mainstream white society will not approve of racial justice to the extent that it will change power, right? It will only approve racial justice to the extent that mainstream white society remains in power. So when we see the uprisings of 2020, we now see all of this kind of diversity in commercials. We see some policies that have shifted, but 2 years later, we actually realized that those shifts were largely surface level. Very rarely were those shifts institutional. Now, the third piece that becomes important is that we have to get away from racism solely as individualized acts of bigotry. White supremacy is more than that. We have to understand white supremacy / racism as structural and systemic. I live in Chicago. I'm born and raised here in Chicago. Chicago, until 1948, operated under something called restrictive covenants, meaning that if you were Black, you could not live outside of an 8 square mile radius. If it were not for Lorraine Hansberry's father, who sued the city of Chicago and went all the way to the Supreme Court, I wouldn't even live in the neighborhood that I live in now. So now, when you think about this particular set of rules around housing, you also have to think about what that means for education. So if your housing is segregated, your education will be segregated. And more importantly about segregation is the idea that when something is segregated, now resources are taken away from that particular place that's marginalized or isolated. So we talk about that as disinvestment. So investment means things that are put into things. Disinvestment means the things that have been taken away. So now, when we understand white supremacy / racism as structural, we now have to think about who has been harmed and affected by things like federal policy in the form of the Reservation Act that scooped up and regulated indigenous people to certain areas, or the Chinese Exclusion Act that actually would not allow Chinese people to actually enter the United States, or the Bracero program that exploited the labor of Latinx agricultural workers in the Southwest, or Black codes, Jim Crow, that regulated the idea of Black people being full citizens, particularly with the right to vote, the right to have equitable education, and the right to actually engage and have access to land. So now when we think about this structurally, it becomes important. And let me say this about white supremacy, because a lot of times in this moment, we use these words very loosely. When I'm talking about white supremacy, I am deeply specific, and it is a broad stroke, but it has these specificities in it because it allows us to understand the scope of the problem. So when I talk about white supremacy, I am talking about the assumed beliefs, views, and values of white, Western European descended, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual men as normal, right, and good. Everything else has been made strange. Everything else has been othered. And the laws reflect how people have been othered, right? So now when we think about critical race theory, it also says that because of white supremacy, race is differentialized in a number of different ways. And let me go quickly into what I mean by racial differentialization. Certain racial groups are counted based, or are included, I should say, based on their proximity to whiteness. Now, many of us see this term model minority, right? And that's a stereotype that's ascribed often to Asian American Pacific Islander folks. Before that came into being, Mexican families were thought of as the model minority, right? And then after the Asian American stereotype comes in, you also, until 9/11, you get a conversation around South Asian and Middle Eastern families being model minorities, right? And this thing around even the term minority, what does it mean? Now, demographically, some people will argue that it might mean less than or what have you, but there's a contradiction in that term. People of color are 90% of the world's population. So now, how do we get into that understanding and that particular ascription to folks being minority? Now, people may say that that's a term that is local to the United States, but when we look at the world's population, we see something else. So now, when we start to think about this, critical race theory also reminds us that because of our experiences with white supremacy, there is a unique understanding that people of color have, and that understanding often goes ignored. The question we have to ask is, why is it ignored? Now, let's kick it back to Executive Order 13950. So now you have this national precedent around eliminating this type of conversation that I'm having with you in any kind of federal training on diversity. Other groups of people pick this up and say, well, we don't need this conversation in schools. And my retort is always, this is the problem. Because we don't talk about structural racism, enslavement, genocide, wrongful land appropriation in the form of settler colonialism, we are in the situation that we're in now. Now, let me be clear. Some folks think that everything is good. And if we stick to what we used to do, then everything will be okay. Folks in critical race theory say that inherent is the problem. We have ascribed these myths and we have no analysis of what actually happened. And now when we actually start to engage what happens, people get scared. And what we're really seeing all the way from April of 2020 to January 6th is people being scared and actually people being misinformed. And in that fear, they start doing things like robbing their own house. So this is what I see January 6th as being, right? A bunch of white folks who said, look, they lied to us and we're just gonna go trash the spot that we actually own and still holds power and has done nothing to literally oppress us. Because we have a faulty schooling system in the United States, people don't have the wherewithal to even ask a critical question around what's being fed to them. So now critical race theory and accurate views of history are saying it is imperative for us to ask critical questions of our conditions, because if we don't, we are doomed to repeat the exact same thing. And what we've seen, what the COVID moment has shown us, is that moment will be even worse. So COVID has just magnified the travails of white supremacy and capitalism. It has only reminded us of the deep permanence and totality of what it means to exist under those two things. And now, when we talk about why something like critical race theory is so controversial, people think about this as the upheaval to everything being okay. And the issue is, for many of us, it has never been okay. And now, because it has never been okay, we don't want to make things worse than what they already have been. So now critical race theory is becoming this flashpoint. But again, it's not just about critical race theory. It's really around the fear of engaging with accuracy and criticality. Because when you are accurate, now you're asking questions that are going to get folks unsettled. And a state that you all border, Virginia, has officially banned the conversation in public schools. So now when we start to engage this, we have to think about the United States is obsessed with myth. And any modicum of truth threatens that myth. So if we are threatening the myth, now the defenders of the myth will go even harder to maintain it. So now when we start to think about this in real time, what does it look like? And now, how are we seeing these particular things come at us in the myriad of ways? I wrote a book in 2016 that I think now is banned in about 3 school districts, right? And what it talks about is critical race theory. It talks about engaging young folks and families, and it talks about the decisions that young people and families made to ensure quality education. But that becomes controversial because in the book I discuss that people were willing to challenge systems. People were willing to say that things are not good and that they are not right. And this is what we will do, not only as a corrective measure, but as a sustainable measure for the generations that come after us. So what we're seeing now is a generational struggle. And ironically, we've been here before, right? The United States, a lot of people get fearful around when we talk about the election of Donald Trump and that being a turning point. Absolutely not. That was just a reminder that the United States has been what it has always been. And you elect a strongman character in that way when you fear the accuracy of the historical record and when you fear people rising up and refusing to take what you give them. And that's what 2020 was. People got fearful because they started to understand if this uprising lasts longer, there is nothing we can do. And that is the power of people engaging historical accuracy and the truth. And this is why we get all this heat around critical race theory. This is why we're not talking about what it actually says. This is why it becomes a straw man character when the fight is really around you being able to engage with accuracy, fidelity, and truthfulness. And this becomes the issue. And we have to be clear that this issue has not only been with us for this moment, but in 1931, you had the sedition, you had the Smith Act that was actually persecuting people for sedition because they were talking about socialist understandings, particularly regarding the distribution of wealth and resources. In the 1950s, you had the House Un-American Activities Committee run by McCarthy, where people were brought up in sham hearings and accused of being communists and fueling information to the Eastern Bloc. We saw this in the Black Freedom Movement when folks were demanding the right to vote, and what is on the midterm elections docket? The right to vote. So we've been here before. And critical race theory is only reminding us that we've been here before. But because we've been here before, there is a duty and responsibility to work. There's a duty and responsibility to refute these things that take us further away from historical accuracy and the truth. And if we do not engage in that work, then we get what we deserve. And sometimes that's shocking for people to hear. And when we think about it in this moment, I am reminded of what folks did 50, 100, 200, 300, 400 years before me. And critical race theory is only a reminder that I am part of that legacy. And because I am, there is a deep responsibility to work to change the condition. Because for some people, things are not good. And it will only be folks who are committed to fight to make things different. So again, many of you all have heard this stuff. Hopefully, I have brought a little bit of clarity to the situation. You have probably seen why folks like myself continue to be uninvited to certain things. I'm glad Salisbury got the courage to invite somebody like myself and understand that this is a fight that we are in perpetuity. I hope this is making sense, and I hope that what it is that you all do from this day forward will be a reflection of your refusal of white supremacy. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much for your thought-provoking and passionate remarks, Dr. Stovall. I'm excited that we'll continue to have this conversation and delve deeper into the Q&A period. And I do go ahead and encourage participants to start posting questions in the chat as we'll be moving to that portion of the program next. My name is Dr. Jennifer Jewell. I'm the director of the School of Social Work, and I want to spend a little bit of time setting the context for our discussion. Critical race theory, CRT. Critical race theory is a legal, academic, theoretical framework centered on the idea that racism is normal, endemic, foundational, as said just now by Dr. Stovall. Racism is systemic. Developed by legal scholars decades ago, this framework aims to help us understand how structural and racial disparities endure and how racism continues to get played out in our society. While individuals can indeed be prejudiced and biased, racism and its outcomes are perpetrated throughout our society through laws, policies, and practices. Racism has been weaved into the fabric of our institutions: housing, justice system, healthcare, social services, political system, education, in K-12, but also in higher education systems like at Salisbury University. The debates making headlines aren't about whether school-age children should learn the nuances of CRT, but rather whether they should learn a history that's more honest and less whitewashed. And what's ironic is that the banning of CRT, or banning the teaching of systemic racism, white privilege, is actually an example of systemic racism. Yet some states, such as our neighbor, the state of Virginia, and school boards are doing just that. We have folks running on platforms that they will ban CRT from our school systems. But why? Why? Some have fear of raising consciousness about structural inequalities because it shines a light on many of the systems in which we operate. Fear of us teaching about structural racism because it does implicate many of our practices. Re-examining our history is not easy to do, especially when it requires self-criticism. As a white person operating in a predominantly white institutions, I want to have a frank and direct conversation with my people, other white folks. As white people, we have been good students of white supremacy, socialized in a system where we do not need to talk about race or how our race comes with a set of natural born privileges, giving us a head start. All people are not created equal where racism can be found, thus often forcing others to put in double time to reach where we start. As white people, we need to push ourselves to learn and understand others' lived experiences that are omitted from our textbooks and are sugar-coated because that truth is just not pretty. As white people, we have to shake off white apathy and accept greater responsibility in dismantling systems of oppression. Racism is not a Black problem or a Latinx problem, it's a people problem. And white people for too long have ignored their role, our role in benefiting from, participating in, and maintaining racism. As white people, we have to accept greater responsibility in dismantling racism and white supremacy. Critical race theory offers us an opportunity to open up that discussion, a dialogue that we hope to start and continue today about how we all have inherited this society and the inequalities that are insidious and persistent within the structures in which we live, operate, and work. CRT gives us the space to have courageous conversations about that history and enduring inequalities. So why is that important to us as an institution? As Dr. Stovall discussed, we have to be about the critical and reflective action to then interrupt these patterns that maintain systems of oppression. It's imperative that we radically reimagine and create systems that support, benefit, and lift up all. We have to believe that another world, another SU is possible. Given this task at SU, we have to have a radical imagination. We can't be distracted by Band-Aid solutions that do not lead to deep systemic change. Raising awareness is an important first step, as many folks, especially white folks, have not had to explore at any great penetrating depth the atrocities experienced and continually experienced by people of color and other unrepresented groups in the US. But we can't get stuck in that necessary step. This is necessary but insufficient in creating structural change. At Salisbury University, we are and we have been moving beyond some of these initial steps, such as creating new policies around tenure and promotion that recognize the additional work that underrepresented groups have to carry, such as mentoring or representation on committees. In some units, faculty and staff are required to clearly articulate and operationalize goals around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. We are seeing more activities and lectures that highlight the lived experiences of our diverse communities. At SU, we are attempting to chip away at some of the embedded policies and practices that penetrate inequality, and we're trying to move forward toward a more just Salisbury University. I want to thank Dr. Stovall again for his powerful words and his help in reminding us of our duty to work and prompting us to engage in politics of interruption. I would like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Flores, who will facilitate our Q&A period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jewell, for your impassioned words. I continue to, in my tenure here at Salisbury University, continue to learn from you in the spaces and just the way you speak and the way you articulate things is just so unbelievably impressive. As we get to this Q&A section, I'm first grateful to be here and humbled to be part of this conversation. And I'd like to remind people, if they are going to ask questions, please post those into the chats. And then if you want to come in and have those conversations and ask those specifically to Dr. Stovall, please keep the monologue or the contextualization of your questions to a minimum in order for us to be able to get to as many people as possible. We know we learn best from the multitudes of dialogue that we have, and the more conversations that we can engage in here, the better the learning experience will be. Dr. Stovall, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to get us going here with the very first question. And you mentioned in your conversation, you talked about stakeholders, you talked about the bans with critical race theory and these aspects in a lot of places in schools. You talked about your book being banned. I know that there's, I think, 17 states that are currently looking to expand their conversations about race and sexuality and racism in states. But at the same time, there's 36 states that either have or have bills that have passed or on the docket to pass to restrict these conversations. What advice do you give stakeholders in these contexts in order for them to push back when they want their children and their people to be experience these conversations and take part in these conversations, these real conversations in those educational contexts?
Definitely. Thanks so much, Dr. Flores, for that question. And thanks again, Dr. Jewell, for your rejoining comments. I think the most important pushback in this moment is for folks to have a question to the naysayers, right? So what the question should always be, what is the problem with historical accuracy? And what is our commitment to fooling young people? Because here's what we know. Young people, when they figure out they have been fooled, they will reject anything else you put forward, right? So this idea around what is the problem with historical accuracy, right? And then what I've seen folks in schools do is they start to poll their students around how they feel when they were engaged with historical accuracy and how does it help them understand learning, right? So this thing around really putting in the context of learning and now saying, what is this connection to myth? And then pushing back on the naysayers and saying, why are we so committed in fooling young folks? Because because what usually happens is they go right into a conversation about what they refer to as something being age appropriate. And this is always my response to people talking about age appropriateness. If a young person is able to experience white supremacy in the forms of marginalization, isolation, and containment, then they're old enough to be engaged with historical accuracy. Because what we are doing is affirming their life and their capacity to change conditions. Now, the other thing that we see a lot of the naysayers say, they talk about this makes white kids feel bad about themselves. My first response is, well, damn, what do you think this has been doing to students of color for the last 400 years in schools in the United States? 250 years solid when you get public education systems. And if it does make folks feel upset, then let's use that as the teaching moment and say, you know what, you're upset. You should be, because this has been kept from you. Now, because you are upset, let us remind ourselves of the commitment to history. Now that you know these things, it is your job to see that they never happen again. Right? So now when we start to think about this, it's always shifting that argument from, teaching folks about racism, right? Talking about historical accuracy is not teaching folks to be racist. It's actually improving our skills around research, right? So now I think that's really important when folks see these bills come on the docket, when you see these school board takeovers, to really push back and say, what is our issue with historical accuracy? And now, if we don't have an issue with historical accuracy, then what do you want to be taught? And if that thing you're choosing that you want to teach is connected to more of these myths, then we can't have that. right? And I think that's really important to do that collectively, right? Because a lot of times teachers are singled out, parents are singled out, students are singled out. So a collective presence when you do this really becomes important for folks who are seeing this type of decision-making happening in their local schools or in the broader district.
Dr. Stovall, one of the panelists or one of the attendees has put in the chat as a question. It says, what can we as individuals and educators do to help move forward toward creating more equity and promoting CRT?
Yeah, I think there are some really important spaces that you all can check out. There is the Howard Zinn Education Project that has really been important around supporting folks in engaging in historical accuracy and critical analysis. And I think what they have created is a really important toolkit around looking at this current resistance to historical accuracy. Another space is the African American Policy Forum and their Truth Be Told campaign. And it's also an important piece because it documents the trajectory and timeline of a lot of this anti-CRT legislation. And I think another thing that's important is to remember that this is as much about CRT as it is about historical accuracy, right? And now thinking about the ways that we can actually engage the work to not only just create these kind of talking points, but to really go back to a conversation around what CRT is in opposed to what it is not. Because when we're made to backpedal, then it makes the argument even harder to make. So I think it's really important to start with what CRT is. And then now when you see what it is, you see this diversion in terms of what actually is being opposed, right? So it's really outing the lie. And I think that strategy really becomes important. And the Truth Be Told campaign and the Zinn Education Project really do a good job of how to do that at the local level. One other resource is the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education at New York University actually created a guidepost, a toolkit for educators around critical race theory. And it's really good, very digestible, really explanatory. And I think when we have those explanatory resources, it really allows us to have a different conversation in opposed to just doing that backpedaling.
Dr. Stovall, how do these bans harm students of color and their white classmates?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is when you, and I say this as a social studies educator, right? So the joke I would always put to my students is, look, social studies was intended to bore you, right? It was intended to bore you because if I can continue to bore you to death, you will reject this thing and never ask questions of your history, right? So now, how do we work to interrupt that boredom? How do we work to make sure that we now have the research tools to actually engage, and any questions that we have, we can now begin to look at those through a lens of asking a question, looking at the multitude of perspectives, and then looking at how things have played out in history. When we don't do that, we get more of the same. And that's the harm, right? Lying to young people about their contributions to the world is deeply harmful, because now what I can do is I can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. I can keep telling you that you're not going to be able to do things, that there's something wrong with you. And if I keep saying that to you long enough, you will believe it. And for white kids, if I keep this narrative of white supremacy, you will now not have any lens on how to interrupt it. You will resort to the fact of this is the way things are, right? When history has shown you that people have refused that, right? So I think that's the harm that it brings to young folks, right? When we lie, now it takes us further away from even thinking about our contributions to the broader world and changing our conditions.
Thank you, Dr. Stovall. Another question that kind of links all these pieces together is from a participant. It says, when we think about action, how can folks use Du Bois, Davis, and Davis's abolition democracy? I would even throw in Bettina's love work in that point as well from an abolitionist teaching perspective, democracy in a systemic and incremental way to move forward racially just infrastructures.
Yep. And the thing, I think this is really important. So when W.B. Du Bois talked about an abolition democracy and Angela Davis revisited the concept, the idea was, here are the things that are unacceptable. Those things cannot exist in their current form. Now, the most important thing is reform is not enough. We don't need to make this thing that was working terribly a little bit better. We need something completely different, right? So now when we talk about, so when Bettina talks about an abolitionist teaching, we now have to think about what are the things that are unacceptable? What are the things that we will not do, right? And she talks about in the concept of Patricia Williams' spirit murder, right? How will we make a commitment not to murder the spirit of our young people, right? And if we make that commitment, now what do we use as resources? How do we begin to engage in that criticality, in those forms of inquiry that now allow us to see something different and possibilities therein? Now, the issue, and I think the mistake that folks make, is we assume schools to be good. And that brings about a problem, right? Because there's a difference between schooling and education. Schooling is the rewards that you have for order and compliance and your capacity to regurgitate the rules of white supremacy. Education is you literally asking a different set of questions and refusing that thing that has continued to harm, marginalize, and isolate you, right? And when we think about those good teachers that we've had in our school experiences, however few they may be, we always have to go back and think, why was that good teacher always in trouble, right? Because structurally, the system rewarded order and compliance. Those teachers were not concerned about order and compliance, but were more concerned about you being in the world as a person who could shift it with others, right? And I think that's always the question at hand when we're talking about this, right? We have to be intentional about where we're going and how we now think about our work moving forward.
Dr. Stovall, another one of our attendees posted a question here, two questions, and I think they're foundational to these conversations. And I find that sometimes this concept of anti-racism is very challenging to understand for certain populations of people. And the questions there are how you define anti-racism and what is it, and how is anti-racism different from not racist? And I know we could refer back to maybe white fragility and some other conversations about Ibram X's anti-racism work, but from your perspective specifically, what are those constructs and how do we engage that?
Yeah, and I think that there is, when we look at the term anti-racist, right? And it's really around it's an active stance, right? So how are we actively opposing racism / white supremacy, right? And not racist is more static, right? Not racist is saying, well, that person has not exhibited these particular behaviors. Now, they still might hold them, right? But they necessarily haven't exhibited them. Whereas anti-racist is saying what are you actively doing to interrupt this, right? How are you joining forces with folks to work to interrupt this? And how do you, more importantly, even understand racism and white supremacy? I think that really becomes important when you talk about any type of anti-racist struggle. Because, and then the other part is, what is anti-racism connected to, right? So now critical race theory says we need to understand the world as intersectional, right? So now when we understand the world as intersectional, we understand how we operate and exist in it along the lines of race, class, gender, age, ability, sexual orientation. When we go into a lot of the anti-racist literature, it stops at racism, right? The real work is connecting it, right? So I have a critique of both, right? So anti-racism needs to expand itself, and then not racist is just a static description of somebody, and again, just them not exhibiting particular behaviors.
Thank you. One of the attendees posts it specifically to nursing in the medical field, and we know the systemic issues within racism within the medical field itself. It says, as a nursing student, how can we ensure our clients have access and care and feel comfortable coming to receive care?
Yep, and I think this is an excellent question, and I think it's really important when we talk about the medical industry, when we talk about the medical professions, when we talk about medical science. We have to come to grips with a legacy of wrongful experimentation on people of color. And many families have direct experience with that, whether it be wrongful experimentation or the lack of care or the wrong care. So now we have to think about that in real time. So now what you have to do is be able to go out to the communities that you intend to serve and really start to engage in some deep questions around community distrust of medicine, right? And really being able to ease those particular points of anger, but you only do it by way of engaging. You have to show up in those spaces, right? You can't just be holed up in the clinic or holed up in the hospital. You have to be in communities with folks to understand where it is that they're going with this. I would encourage folks to look up the work of a physician who's here in Chicago named Monique Jindal. And she does what's called community-based medicine. And she starts out with the understanding that the medical profession has deeply wronged communities of color. And now, as a doctor, what do I do to actually engage those communities while first addressing the issues and concerns that they have? I think that's a critical point, because this is why a lot of your communities refuse vaccination. We have to understand that for many folks, that's an informed decision, right? If we look at the history of medical experimentation, right? We have to really think about that. And now, if we're going to ease those concerns, you have to be out in those spaces, right? You have to make those things accessible that people have not had access to, right? It's really around shifting how the principles of treatment now become the principle of authentic engagement, right? Understanding the history of the medical professions in communities of color, because that is a critical junction. We have to be deeply honest about what's happened historically.
A question circles back to the education context, and it says, how do we keep children from rejecting all school taught education when they acknowledge that they have been taught segregated education?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really around, we have to be able to ask young people what resonates with them, right? And why does it resonate? right? And then we also have to ask the question, what has been their schooling experiences before they got to you, right? So really what's happening is we're doing an intake of how young folks are understanding their world and condition. And now, what are the things that they're concerned about? And can we use our content and our pedagogy to address those concerns, right? So it's a very different model than kind of a scripted curriculum, okay, in January, we're gonna do this, February, we're gonna do this. It's really around saying, no, okay, if I go on your concerns, then our curriculum looks a little different. And then to go even deeper, what does it even mean to plan curriculum with your students, right? So now it's this thing around, okay, here's what works. Because now you can really kind of break this thing out around pedagogy or what have you and say, well, look, here's how teaching is set up. Does this work or should we be doing something else, right? Because I think the main component is what we're pushing on young folks in many ways is not working. And what those good teachers are doing is figuring out ways to connect to young folks. So when these issues and concerns happen, you have a strategy, you got a process that you can go right into to address those issues and concerns, right? So it's really around, if we're thinking about education is a collective act that's engaged by people with different experiences. Because now, as a hired teacher in terms of your employment, you now have to reconfigure that and think about yourself as a learner, right? And now when we think about ourselves as learners, how do we now begin to engage strategies and processes that encourage all of our learning, right? So I think those are really important points when we're talking about engaging young folks.
Dr. Stovall, I'd like to end with just one more question. For anybody that's in attendance that is either kind of grappling with these constructs of CRT and how do they engage in it and do they even trust it or believe in it, or even the people that we interact with in the community, what do you suggest as a foundational piece of literature or book or something for us to go to be able to really get past all that dis and misinformation and get to that nugget of what the true essence of this is, in order for us to have a more informed conversation, and understanding ourselves, and then conversation with others?
Okay. And thanks to the folks in the chat who have been looking up the things and putting them out that I've been talking about. The first book, and this is kind of the foundational book in critical race theory, is Race, Racism, and American Law by Derek Bell. The second would be a book by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic called Critical Race Theory, an Introduction. The third would be a book called Critical Race Theory, Key Writings That Defined the Movement. And that is edited by Kimberly Crenshaw, Neil Gatanda, Kendall Thomas, and Charles Lawrence. So that's another book that I think is important. And then when you think about education, Marvin Lynn and Adrian Dixon did an edited volume called The Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education. And so all of these things that I have suggested, other than Race, Racism, and American Law, are overviews of the construct and then how the construct is used. So you can see where people are taking the construct, how people are using the tenets, and then you get a description of what CRT is.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stovall, for your time. And this kind of wraps up our opportunity to have that question answer time. I'm really grateful. I'm sure there's a lot more questions out there. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Eli, if you want to jump back in and kind of wrap things up for us for the day. Thank you. Dr. Stovall. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much, Dr. Flores. Truly appreciate it.
So I, again, just want to thank you, Dr. Stovall, for your powerful message and for the real lessons that you gave us on why some of the things are the way that they are. I also want to thank the attendees that joined us today, as well as those that are watching the recording. As we close the summit, the planning committee wanted to send you away with some follow-ups. First, a challenge for everyone to identify at least one change that you will make or one action that you will take based on what you've learned, heard, or are taking away from today's summit. If you'd like, you can send those into the Office of Diversity and Inclusion email, which is odi@salisbury.edu, and we'll post them on the website to help others get started on some of their next steps or action items. Second, we encourage you to examine the resource list that Dr. Stovall provided and some of the literature that he just mentioned in the program. That list, along with today's recording, will be posted on the Diversity and Inclusion website as well. Finally, we want to encourage all of you to join us for a follow-up event that will be held on April the 8th. I think we know that we have to keep this momentum going and talk about some of the changes and actions that we're going to take, and we're going to do some of that on April the 8th. More information about that follow-up event will be posted online and shared with the campus and broader community. We hope that there will be an in-person element of that event, in addition to continuing to provide the virtual option. Finally, critical race theory will be one of the topics of our upcoming series. That's a special topics with SU series that's going to be hosted by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. So there will be a number of opportunities for follow-ups and continued discussion around this very important topic. So again, I want to thank Dr. Stovall and thank all of our attendees for watching, because Black History Month is certainly should be celebrated, because Black history is a part of American history. And you all being here today shows your acknowledgement of that. So thank you all for attending. And again, thank you, Dr. Stovall.
Thank you all again. Truly appreciate it.